Hello, my name's Simon Swift, and I'm a lecturer in critical and cultural theory at the School of English in the University of Leeds. And the title of this podcast is, What is a Symbol? What is a Metaphor? What do we mean when, especially in our reading of poems, we describe something as symbolic or as metaphorical? In my previous podcast, which was called The Distraction of Biography, I was encouraging us to think again about what we mean by an author. In particular, about what we mean or what we might mean by an author's intentions, and ultimately to think about the relationship between an author and the words on the page. I want to use the space of this podcast to do something similar with poetry, to stop and look again at the language we use to describe the ways in which poems communicate to us. It seems to me that we are too often inclined to claim that something is a metaphor, or to claim that something is symbolic, and then to move on very quickly in our reading, without stopping to think about what is at stake in these words, or what they tell us about the way that poems operate. Often students in a seminar will say, this is symbolic of ... And I always want to stop them and say, what do you mean by a symbol? What do you mean by symbolic? Because it seems to me that a great deal of ground is being covered very quickly by this word symbolic. And this seems to me to be a real shame, because we start to get a really important sense of what's special about poetry when we slow things down and think about this word symbol, and think about the idea of the symbolic, and think about the idea of metaphor. Thinking about these words helps us to think about what poetry is and what's particular about it. The first thing to say about these two words then, symbol and metaphor, is that they are different, they have different meanings, and we need to begin by making a distinction between them. A symbol, of course, is an object or an image or a word or even a number which is meant to refer to something else, which stands in for something else. But of course, a symbol doesn't have to be a part of language. Symbols can be all kinds of things. Road signs, for example, are symbols, but they may not have words on them. The picture of a man on a toilet door telling us that this is the men's toilets, that this is the gents, is a symbol, but there's no words attached to it. So symbols exist in all kinds of different contexts. Mathematicians, for example, might use particular letters to refer to quantities in equations. They might use letters symbolically. So my traumatic memories of GCSE maths tell me that the mathematician will often say, let x equal ... This is a deep and traumatic and ancient memory. But what's happening in the form of that equation is that x is standing as a symbol. It stands in for, it represents a certain quantity, a certain number. So not only is there nothing specifically linguistic about the symbol, not only is the symbol necessarily a part of language, the symbol isn't necessarily a part of literature either. Symbols can be used in mathematics, and symbols are constantly used in our everyday lives. And indeed, if you look the word symbol up in the Oxford English Dictionary, you'll find that the first definition of the word symbol is concerned with religious belief. The first meaning of the symbol that is given by the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, concerns religion. But the important thing to note here, I think, is that the symbol stands in a relationship of substitution. The symbol stands in for and represents something else, which isn't there. Metaphor shares this quality of substitution with the symbol, this quality of standing in for or representing something else, which isn't present, which isn't visible. Let's have a look at the definition of metaphor from the Oxford English Dictionary. It's always useful with these terms to go and have a look at the Oxford English Dictionary. That's something I really encourage my first year students in particular to do. The OED defines metaphor as the figure of speech in which a name or descriptive term is transferred to some object different from, but analogous to, that to which it is properly applicable. I think there are two things to notice here. The first thing is that, unlike with the symbol, here we are thinking about language. So I said that symbols don't necessarily have to be linguistic, and in their origin they aren't literary. But with metaphor, we are certainly thinking about specific properties of language. The second thing to notice is that unlike the symbol, the metaphor has a relationship to the thing that it represents. This is a different quality from the symbol. The metaphor stands in what the OED calls an analogous relationship to the thing it represents. There is no inherent relationship, no natural relationship, if you like, between X in the mathematical formula and the number, the quantity that X stands for. And that's why in those traumatic memories of GCSE maths, the equation tells us, let X equal ... The equation is telling us what X represents. Because there's nothing about X that tells us what it represents. Or, another example would be road signs, if you're a driver. In this country we use triangular signs to signal a hazard or a danger to drivers or to pedestrians. But there's nothing about the triangle, the shape of the triangle, that naturally is connected to, is related to the idea of danger or hazard. That's a convention that we've agreed upon. But again, there's no inherent relationship between the triangle and danger. That's something we've learned. So symbols are everywhere in the world around us. But they don't usually have a natural relationship to the thing that they describe or stand for. But in the description of the metaphor in the OED, we get this wonderful sense of movement, of transfer, of carrying over, of the properties of one thing being transferred to another thing, to which it's related. We get a sense of connection, of vital link and unity. So in a metaphor, a word or a name or a quality or a descriptive term is taken from its normal context and placed in a different context. But it's not a completely random context. It's analogous. There is a relationship between the new context and the old one. And the OED's reference to carrying over, to transfer, relates to the root meaning of the word, the etymology of the word. Metaphor is a word of Greek descent, and its Greek original means to carry and to transfer. So let's look at an example of this operation of metaphor from one of my favourite poets, which is William Wordsworth, the Romantic poet. So a tip I'd want to give you as a lecturer is to always think about how poets read their own poems. Often poets are very good critical readers of other poets and of their own work. And in some very lucky situations, we get to read those words. So Wordsworth published a preface to his own poems in which he gives us a reading of those poems. This is a really useful thing to do in your own reading if you want to read more widely in the canon. Read what poets say about their own work. Okay, so let's have a look at the passage that Wordsworth is talking about. He's describing the song of the cuckoo, the bird, the cuckoo. His voice was buried among trees, yet to be come at by the breeze. O cuckoo, shall I call thee bird, or but a wandering voice? The italics in this passage are Wordsworth's own, so he's drawing our attention to particular words in his poem. Wordsworth, in the preface, talks about the fact that we often hear cuckoos in springtime, but we seldom see them. They remain in the woods. So we often hear the song of the cuckoo, but we seldom see the bird. And he explains that this is why he describes that song as a wandering voice. His voice was buried among trees, a metaphor expressing the love of seclusion by which this bird is marked, and characterising its note as not partaking of the shrill and the piercing, and therefore more easily deadened by the intervening shade. Yet a note so peculiar, and withal so pleasing, that the breeze, gifted with that love of the sound which the poet feels, penetrates the shades in which it is entombed and conveys it to the ear of the listener. The first thing I want to notice about this passage is the number of references to death which extend the terms of the metaphor which is in the poem itself. This metaphor is found, as Wordsworth tells us, in the line, his voice was buried among the trees. So buried is the site of the metaphor. It's a kind of funereal, deathly metaphor. And Wordsworth is extending the terms of that metaphor in writing about the poem. So what he means is that he hears the sound of the cuckoo, but he doesn't see him. And somehow this hearing a sound without seeing the bird gives him a sense that the voice itself is buried among trees. I suppose what he's saying is that this hearing a voice without a body gives a sense of the spirit, something which is heard but isn't seen, something which is ethereal, something which isn't material. There's something bodiless, something disembodied about the bird's song. So these are the terms of the metaphor. The idea of death and burial are carried over, are transferred. Remember the meaning of that word, metaphor, to describe the sound of the bird's song to the ear of the poet. How do you bury a voice? It's a very strange claim to make. What is it about the voice of the bird, the wandering voice, as the poet has it, that makes him think about death? What is the relationship, the metaphorical relationship between death and the bird's voice, the bird's song? The passage is, in fact, quite ghostly, if you think about it. The voice is entombed, says Wordsworth, in the shades of the wood, but at the same time it penetrates those shades. As you may know, you may not, shade is an old word for ghost. Ghosts were often described as shades. So that it almost seems as if the song of the cuckoo is like a ghost, is like a wandering shade in the woods, which will accord with the sense of the voices being buried or entombed in the woods, but also active, penetrating the woods. Like a ghost, the voice of the cuckoo is buried, entombed, and also active, wandering. There is something dead and undead at the same time about this cuckoo's voice. But the voice seems to be brought back to life, in some sense, by the breath of the breeze. And Wordsworth's introducing this idea of wind or breeze into his poem. So Wordsworth brings the breeze to life. He allows it to share in his own joy in the cuckoo's song. And this is another example of metaphor. The breeze is given human qualities, a capacity to share in the joy of the poet. So the notion in this passage of the breeze being gifted with the joy of the poet feels metaphorical too. If you think about a gift, Wordsworth's word is gifted. If you think about what a gift is, it involves some kind of transition, some kind of exchange or giving over. A gift, in a sense, has this kind of quality of metaphor, which involves movement, transition, transferal. So I think that Wordsworth's prose adds layer and layer to an original metaphor, which he identifies in his poem, the metaphor of the voice being buried in the woods, but yet penetrating the woods through the agency of the breeze, the voice being a ghost in some sense, getting through an intervening shade. So I think, just to conclude the podcast, he's talking about the voice of the cuckoo, but actually he's talking about lots of other things. In a way, he's using the voice of the cuckoo, and he's using the metaphors that that voice generates in his mind to think about a much broader, much bigger issue. He's talking about death, for sure, as an intervention which might cut off the living voice. Maybe he's even thinking about his own death. But he's also talking about the breath of inspiration. Breeze, wind, figures very often as a source of creative inspiration in Wordsworth, of life-giving. And he's thinking about the capacity of the breeze to bring the voice back to life. And so I think that he is talking, in fact, about the capacities of poetry, of figurative language, to survive its own death, or rather to survive the death of the poet, and to become a ghostly, shady voice that continues to exist and move other entities. And of course, death itself is something that we are obliged to talk about in metaphorical terms, as a passing away, as a transition, as a movement of some sort. Our language to discuss death is a language of metaphor. Thank you.